there are four elements to what I'm about to talk to you about. The first and the biggest is Joe Biden's speech yesterday on the anniversary of the attempt, really, by the defeated candidate in the last American election to launch an armed insurrection by his own supporters upon the actual Capitol. And the fact that I say those words with a slight sense of, really? Is part of the problem, I think. It's obvious what happened. The footage is there. The testimony, the evidence that is coming out now is incredible. Absolutely incredible. But it's so beyond our comfort zone that I think even people who are following events quite closely are tempted to go, no, don't worry about it. And that leads into element two of the conversation that I'm about to have with you now, which is, and I hope you're familiar with it, probably the Liza Minnelli film, possibly if you're lucky enough to have seen it, the production currently in London's West End starring Eddie Redmayne and Jessie Buckley, but Cabaret, based upon, of course, the work of Christopher Isherwood, the English novelist, and describing how Nazism essentially crept up on Weimar Republic Germany, how Nazism was so ridiculously awful that nobody thought it would ever happen. Hitler kind of laughed at for years, even locked up. So you would see the beer hall putsch when Hitler launched an attempted coup, failed miserably and got sent to jail. That would be the January the 6th. And you all know how that story ends. So this idea that normal people, and that's the phrase I'm going to use to describe myself, with apologies to Sally Rooney and permission from you, normal people find the idea of the really horrible stuff too awful to actually believe or to contemplate. So that's strand two, Joe Biden's speech, strand one. Then Cabaret, or the warning, or the way that the worst stuff creeps up on you. Michael Rosen, I think it was, said something brilliant about fascism coming in carpet slippers, not jack boots. It sort of creeps up on you in a covert coat with a monocle. It doesn't come in with bayonets and goose steps. And then I've got a book by an American, what you might call a Civil Warologist, called Barbara F. Walter. It's a remarkable book called How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them. And I read a review of it. I haven't actually read the book yet, but I read a couple of reviews of it in Christmas week. David Aranovich in the Times, particularly alarmed by this study, which shows that all the signs of previous conflicts are now present in America. That is the book that constitutes strand three of the conversation that we're about to start. And then strand four, and I don't want to unduly advertise any rivals, but there's a rather splendid podcast which I have started listening to by the BBC journalist Gabriel Gatehouse, who I was lucky enough, I'd say privileged enough actually, to work with on BBC Newsnight, called A Storm is Coming, which looks at how, in the simplest terms, how two people living on the same street in America could now have ended up believing two completely different things. And you know, as I've just ended that little introduction to the four things that have prompted me to ask you the question I'm about to ask you, I've realised that, in a way, this programme is proof of the problem that we're about to describe. When did we last talk about American politics? When did we last do an hour on it? I don't think we've done an hour on American politics since Donald Trump lost the last election. The fact that he still claims he didn't lose the last election and that millions of Americans believe him, almost all of whom will own guns, or many of whom will own guns, is part of the problem that I'm now very cautiously contemplating. Because some of the stuff that Joe Biden said yesterday was breathtaking, absolutely breathtaking, and also completely true. And that's what made me think of Cabaret, my friends. Because that was a reference to the lyrics of Cabaret rather than me adopting a slightly folksy approach to introducing the radio programme. Because it is, and I find art often a much easier way to examine history than actual history books. Art, it somehow manages to bring the emotion to the table in a way that all but the most remarkable historians can't really do. This idea, no, it couldn't happen here. There you go. There's a fifth strand if you want. There's a brilliant book called It Couldn't Happen Here about a fictional fascist takeover of America. But it is a question of something being so horrible to contemplate that you don't like looking at it. So Joe Biden won the election. He's a far from perfect president. You know, Afghanistan was an absolute disaster in so many ways, albeit he inherited a degree of inevitability over what ultimately unfolded. He certainly didn't inherit absolute inevitability. There were things he could have done that would have mitigated the disaster of that collapse in Kabul, but and you know, has failed. Whether he could have done a better job or not, whether someone would have done a better job or not of undoing the anti-vaccine, anti-mask nonsense that was popular among followers of his predecessor, I do not know. I can't think how you would have done that, because people defined themselves by objecting, as we've seen it a little bit in this country. The coming storm, it's called. I beg your pardon, not a storm is coming. There we go. First mistake of the day. Good to know that lots of you are exposing yourselves to similar cultural extravaganzas, though. The coming storm, it's called. And we haven't done an hour on it, because once they got rid of Trump, the threat of that, I mean, the very real threat a year ago yesterday of some sort of coup, some sort of, what if they'd succeeded? What if they'd found Mike Pence and killed him? What would Trump have done? So that simple question there. What if Trump's followers, Trump's supporters, who followed his exhortation to fight, remember his words, what if they'd succeeded? What if they'd managed, what if they'd turned one corner half an hour quicker, found Mike Pence, killed the vice president? What would Trump have done then? Think he'd have urged his supporters to go home while endorsing the election victory of Joe Biden? Do you really? I don't. I could be wrong. I don't want to say I hope I'm wrong, because that, I think, is part of the plaintive complacency that I'm sort of alluding to when it comes to what happens when you turn your eyes away from the really horrible, dangerous possibilities. Not definite, not guaranteed, but possibilities. You didn't say Donald Trump's name once in that speech yesterday, and yet it was his very dark shadow that really was cast over all of proceedings. I know it's highly unlikely. I hope this doesn't sound patronising. It's highly unlikely that anybody listening to this programme has read How Civil Wars Start by Barbara F. Walter, has listened to the entirety of the Coming Storm series presented by Gabriel Gatehouse, has, a proper knowledge of 1930s Germany and how the Nazis managed to creep up upon the country, and listen to Joe Biden's speech yesterday. If you have got I'm having to use Cabaret for my idiot's guide to 1930s Germany, so I'm certainly not in the category myself of being supremely qualified to comment on this issue. But if you have got all four of those ticked off, then you go straight to the top of the class today. And even if you've never phoned a radio station before in your life, today you are absolutely required to do so. But for the rest of us, let's just have a little bit of a grope around this morning, which is an unfortunate word to use when you're talking about Donald Trump, of course. Let's just have a little bit of a rummage, because we'll have a little listen to the speech, but we will also, I think, go for the question of serious authors, academics, professors of what we might call civil warology, brilliant journalists, Britain and America. Timothy Snyder in America has gone down this road. Thank you to Spike for pointing out the shadow's not that dark, it's actually orange. And then Joe Biden all seem to fear that America is still teetering upon the brink of something very ugly. I'll ask whether you agree with that, 0345 60 60973. I'll also ask whether you think it's possible. Is America still teetering a year after January the 6th on the brink of something truly horrible? Because something truly horrible very nearly happened on January the 6th of last year. And I think, well, for a variety of reasons, I think we're not paying enough attention. And if you want to help me a little bit today, have a little look at the question of why. Why aren't we paying enough attention? We reported on Donald Trump's various depravities. Some people, of course, reported it with glee and relish and expressed support for his absence of even the vaguest scintillers of common decency and morality. But this bubbling under that Joe Biden essentially talked of yesterday, the knife being held to the throat of democracy, this is the leader of the free world. There's problems is a bit of an understatement. The situation in Kazakhstan is incredibly concerning. And then back over on this side of the world, you've got the leader of the free world talking about a knife being held to the throat of democracy. Do you share his misgivings? 0345 60 60973. And why aren't we talking about it? Why aren't we talking about it? That's perhaps the most important question of all. I think I'll hit the break on time for once because it's Friday and, Keith wasn't very impressed with his Christmas present. So we'll hit the break on time and I'll come back and play you a little bit of the speech. After that, I'd quite like to dive into the calls as quickly as possible. I am British. I live in London. I followed American politics as closely as I could when Donald Trump was president, and that was quite closely because it was reported here endlessly. Simon Marks was on with me all the time. I know he still speaks to Eddie quite regularly, but I think to my shame, I haven't booked Simon Marks for the programme as often as I could have done. I almost felt like the storm had passed, which is why the title of Gabriel Gatehouse's new series, The Coming Storm, is so arresting. But are we still looking at the possibility? You live there, you have family there, you follow things more closely than I do. Is there still a very real danger of something truly horrible unfolding on the other side of the Atlantic that would obviously have ramifications for everybody who considers themselves to be a resident of the free world? Here's a quote from yesterday's speech. "You can't pretend, you've got to face it. That's what great nations do. They face the truth." Are we all still guilty of looking away from it? It was a toss-up, I'm not going to lie to you, between the threat to the security of the free world and possibly the future of civilization as we know it, or the comments of that reality television star Molly May this morning. But we've gone with Joe Biden's speech, and here is a bit of it.
In life, there's truth, and tragically, there are lies. Lies conceived and spread for profit and power. We must be absolutely clear about what is true and what is a lie. And here's the truth. The former President of the United States of America has created and spread a web of lies about the 2020 election. He's done so because he values power over principle, because he sees his own interest as more important than his country's interest, than America's interest, and because his bruised ego matters more to him than our democracy or our Constitution. He can't accept he lost, even though that's what 93 United States senators, his own attorney general, his own vice president, governors and state officials in every battleground state have all said he lost. That's what 81 million of you did as you voted for a new way forward. He has done what no president in American history, the history of this country, has ever done. He refused to accept the results of an election and the will of the American people. While some courageous men and women in the Republican Party are standing against it, trying to uphold the principle of that party, too many others are transforming that party into something else. They seem no longer to want to be the party of Lincoln, Eisenhower, Reagan, the Bushes. But whatever my other disagreements are with Republicans who support the rule of law and not the rule of a single man, I will always seek to work together with them to find shared solutions where possible. Because if we have a shared belief in democracy, then anything is possible. Anything. And so at this moment, we must decide, what kind of nation are we going to be? Are we going to be a nation that accepts political violence as a norm? Are we going to be a nation where we allow partisan election officials to overturn the legally expressed will of the people? Are we going to be a nation that lives not by the light of the truth, but in the shadow of lies?
I'm even more convinced this is an important question to ask now, having reminded you or introduced you to what he said yesterday. I cannot think of any reason why Joe Biden would make that speech unless he was profoundly worried about the continuing subscription to the lies of Donald Trump and the knowledge that Donald Trump would, or the fear, let's put it that way, of what Donald Trump would have done if his rampaging supporters, having stormed the Capitol, had actually found Mike Pence and killed him. That seems to me to be, whether it's based on intelligence or whether it's just based on reading the proverbial room, that seems to be an American president expressing very, very real fears about some sort of possible coup in his own country, continuing fears. How worried should we be? Mike's in Lincoln. Mike, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Yeah, I'm from Texas. Grew up there. Made it to the UK, but I'm actually going back. But we should be very, very concerned because the disconnect between the reality stems not only from just the big lie. Donald Trump has co-opted the same crowd that thought the Civil War was for states' rights versus slavery. And I grew up in a neighborhood where you can knock on every other door and somebody would disagree with you about something so fundamental to American history. And what this causes is this revisionism to where people will just vehemently deny why something so fundamental happened. And the same mechanism that's happened with the first Civil War is being utilized in the second for a prelude to the second. And I think as I'm going back now, what I need to do is to try to find common ground with those who are so different.
Oh, good luck, obviously. I mean, certainly the coming storm, Gabriel Gatehouse's incredible podcast, suggests that you will really struggle to do that. If I could pick your brains briefly on this question of, I mean, I presume seeing the Confederate flag, for example, during that Capitol attack would have confirmed your worst fears. This is the belief that what is the belief? Because some of it's bonkers. Some of the QAnon stuff is inevitably baked into it, and then you've got the anti-vax stuff and things like that. But what is the relationship between Civil War denial? What did they claim? The first. What do they claim?
Well,
the American Civil War.
It's institutionalized. I mean, public schools and the plain person schools, public schools mean something totally different in the UK, but your average, poor person school would teach you that it was about states' rights, which is some esoteric term when the first sources tell you in the state of Texas that we're seceding to preserve slavery.
Yes.
So that being
it's got
said,
echoes of the Edward Colston conversation that we were having yesterday, in a way.
I wanted to call in over that,
right?
But because it's about America, I felt more.
No, I get it. So, I mean, I sit here on the other side of the Atlantic. I've got no actual real skin in the game, to coin a phrase. You clearly do. Texas being, I imagine, a bit of a hot spot for the kind of attitudes that we're discussing today. It still sounds nuts to use the phrase Civil War to me. Does it still sound nuts to you? I mean, nuts with a side order of, whoa, steady on. Does it still sound nuts to you?
I would say it's delusional in a way. I think the people who argue for this, especially on the right, and those who actually have personal arsenals,
yes,
think that it would go. My wife's from Northern Ireland,
oh, blimey.
So I know about about sectarianism to a small degree, and I know about her personal stories.
So you know what can happen when these feelings are inflamed and when unscrupulous leaders use them for their own ends. Just briefly, what do you think would have happened if they'd found Mike Pence? What do you think Donald Trump would have done if his supporters had found Mike Pence and done what they said they were going to do?
Pence or the targeted Democrats,
yeah,
they may have had leniency to Pence. I don't know if they would have assassinated him, but if they got their hands on AOC, Nancy Pelosi, Adam Schiff, they could have done something.
And what would Trump have done? What do you think Trump would have done in those circumstances?
He would have, he knows how to say two things at once and not say anything.
No, he does.
He would have done that. And the media would have, I don't know.
But that's the key point. There's the question. And that's what you've led us to quite perfectly. Thank you, Mike. What would the media have done? You think of Fox News and the well-known names of presenters on there who have come, I mean, as about as close to performative moral corruption as it's possible to imagine. If that insurrection on January the 6th had gone one stage further, if it had been one gear more successful, what would they have done? Apparently, they were all texting furiously, trying to get Donald Trump to call off the protesters, but of course the next day or the day after that or a week later they're on TV claiming that it had nothing to do with Donald Trump. I mean, lying through their teeth. I don't know yet what a call would sound like that says there's nothing to see here, there's nothing to fear, but I do hope I get one. Mike, thank you. Nigel's in Henley-on-Thames. Nigel, what can you tell us?
Oh, good morning, James.
Hello.
I'm a Kidderminster boy as well.
No way, really? It's a small
Yes,
world.
I went to Harry Cheshire and King Charles and then went off to Liverpool University and got 4 degrees there. But I've lived in the States for 9 years, a couple of years in the 80s, and then went back in the late 90s.
Yeah.
And also I've lived over there till 2014 with an American wife.
Gosh.
And I think the fundamental problem is that Fox News has poisoned America with its right-wing views and the lies it produces. And we should fear GB News in this country trying to take us down the same route.
Well, maybe.
So
At the moment, no one's watching it, but I take your point.
Yeah, but in America, it is very influential. And my father took 5 machine gun bullets at Dunkirk to save democracy. He spent 5 years in a prisoner of war camp. Had to march back home, and he had 10 children. I was the 7th. But I think he was just celebrating saving democracy. And here we are in a situation where we could get the same thing all over again.
Do you really believe that? What do you base that fear on, Nigel?
Because I've watched what America's doing. The money talks in America. I've thought many, many years about the democracy, and it's really controlled by money. It started under Bush, where the Bush family were really being funded by overseas people, and they got into power, and they used lawyers to undermine fundamental laws, like what is a prisoner of war or a illegal combatant, and that the Bush administration and the Iraq War took away a lot of the fidelity to commonly held beliefs about how we should treat each other. And then along comes Trump with all his lies. But I listen to a lot of American commentators. Rachel Maddow, who grew up in California, went to Oxford. She's on the MSNBC every day. And I also listen to the funny shows like Bill Maher and John Colbert particularly. But Bill Maher predicted Trump would do this when he was elected. He said he will not go quietly. He will try and hang to power and lie. And when I watched what happened after the election in November, you could see what Trump was doing. Yeah. He was putting his lackeys into the Pentagon, and there was going to be a coup. Any sensible person would have seen that.
So why
we weren't watching it?
No, you were watching it more closely than I was, which is why I'll ask you, why are the alarm bells in America not louder? Because Biden broke the glass yesterday, I think.
Spot on.
Yes.
Biden was spot on. He exposed it. The thing is that power in America is basically around the wealthy people, the billionaires, the 0.1%. And what they're trying to do now is a white supremacy power grab, and they're trying to change all of the states' voting laws so that Trump won't lose next time. And that's what Biden has to do. The problem is we are on a knife edge because the Democrats have a tiny majority. They have one vote in the Senate. They can't get the voting rights bill through without Joe Manchin, who has a coal interest and doesn't want to go down the Democratic route with the Democrats. And him and another person, there's a lady there, there's two Democrats who need to vote to get the Voting Acts right through, and they need also to get rid of the filibuster to get it through before the next election. This midterm could turn both houses over to the Republicans, and that opens the way to stop people voting, and the white supremacists will win, backed up by Murdoch Fox News, because the horrible rhetoric that they put out has caused...
And it is almost, you see, I mean, clearly you're better tuned into this than I am, because I suffer from, I don't know whether you'd call it complacency, but I've still, even now, even with British equivalents bubbling under the surface of our public discourse, and obviously, no accident that Nigel Farage is on the station that you refer to and remains one of the loudest cheerleaders for Donald Trump's depravity in these islands. But I still struggle to believe that people take it seriously, even though the evidence that they do take it seriously is right in front of our eyes. And that, I think, Nigel, is part of the problem. And the best advice we can take to you is to broaden our horizons, listen to more, watch more, and then minimise the chance of being taken by surprise. I shall save it for another day to compare Kidderminster notes, because you've already made me late for the news, but thank you. So the four legs, if you like, or the four strands that I've tried to knit together this morning, and I'm a little bit embarrassed by the second one, having spoken to Nigel and realised that I could and should probably be a lot better informed from primary sources. But I mentioned to you, Joe Biden's speech yesterday is our starting point. The fact that I watched Cabaret earlier this week, and of course its famous depictions of how Nazism crept up on Germany. Well, many people thought that the worst excesses of what transpired could never happen here. The character saying, "Of course they will never hurt me, I am German," who was also Jewish, being the really haunting factor. That's strand 2. So Biden's speech, Cabaret. Then How Civil Wars Start, this astonishing book by an American academic, essentially examining how many of the historical prerequisites for civil war are already in place in America. And then the podcast by the BBC journalist Gabriel Gatehouse, The Coming Storm. Those are the four inspirations, if you like, for this morning's conversations and this morning's questions. Joe Biden hasn't rung in yet. It's unlikely that Christopher Isherwood, the author who inspired Cabaret, will ring in, because he's been dead for a very long time. I'm still holding out for the author of How Civil Wars Start, Barbara F. Walter, but I'm delighted to tell you that Gabriel Gatehouse has rung in. So 1 out of 4, and we're still still going with this for at least another half an hour. And Gabriel joins me on the line now. Gabriel, congratulations on yet another brilliant piece of work.
Thank you, James. Just want to call in and say thanks for plugging my podcast. It's above and beyond.
You're very welcome. Before we move on to that, let's just, may I ask what you made of Biden's speech yesterday? I've used an analogy. I've suggested it sounded like he was breaking the glass on a fire alarm.
Yeah. It was very different, wasn't it, from the way he spoke a year ago at his inauguration. It sounded conciliatory and trying to sort of knit these two halves of America together. I think he's realised that those two halves can't get together if one half thinks that the other half is a criminal cabal that's stolen the election, right? You've got to take that head on, because if you disagree with your political opponents and you can change your leaders at the ballot box, then you'll campaign harder next time and fight them politically. If you think your political opponents are evil and you believe you can't change them at the ballot box because they're rigging elections, well, then people start to look for other options.
And what you've done in The Coming Storm is examine how two people on the same street could have ended up believing this of each other. So you could believe that your neighbour is subscribing to a criminal cabal that stole the election. A lot of the compliments you've received for it point out that you managed to do it without being patronising or condescending. You keep your spirit of inquiry in place throughout. But I wonder whether you were frightened by what you found.
I'm very frightened by what I found. I have to say, I wasn't frightened by I went to this QAnon conference in Dallas, which was a crazy experience. But I wasn't frightened by those people personally at that moment. Nobody was aggressive towards me. Nobody seemed violent. Indeed, they kept saying to me, "Do we look like terrorists to you?" Yeah. Because, of course, the FBI has designated QAnon as a domestic terrorist organization. And, of course, I said to them, "You don't look like terrorists to me." But they were all extremely polite and civil, but they were also deeply convinced that, a significant chunk of America is in the grip of great evil. And when you believe that, that's when people start being able to justify some pretty terrible actions. I don't think those actions have quite happened yet. We saw January the 6th, yes. But, January the 6th, unfortunately, I don't think was a culmination of 4 turbulent Trump years. I think January the 6th, unfortunately, was just the beginning. And
that seems to be what Joe Biden was warning about yesterday. Can you give us a few sort of headlines of what that evil is supposed to consist of? I mean, in this country, I've heard a little bit of talk about satanic paedophile conspiracies, for example. And these are held by outwardly quite ordinary people now.
Right. So that's basically it. I mean, QAnon is this kind of vast, sprawling conspiracy theory of everything that's sucked in previous existing conspiracy theories, anti-Semitic tropes. But its basic tenet is that a cabal of Satan-worshipping pedophiles with Hillary Clinton at its center has taken over the levers of power in America and globally. And this includes the media, it includes politicians, it includes Hollywood, it includes big tech.
Probably includes you and me for the purposes of this conversation.
It certainly does include you and me, James. And that these people have taken over the world for evil purposes. And people who believe this, they're a spectrum, right? So the spectrum, at one end of the spectrum might be, well, I believe there was some malfeasance in the election and I think we're not sure who won, all the way through to, Hillary Clinton eats babies and drinks their blood. So it's this spectrum. And what is happening in American society right now, and particularly in the Republican Party, is there is a battle for control of the Republican Party going on between the people on that spectrum and the sort of traditionalists who in their hearts believe that, of course, the election wasn't stolen.
Yeah.
Donald Trump got a lot of votes. A lot of people voted for him, and a lot of people voted for him for perfectly legitimate reasons, right? It's not like 75 million Americans are voting for him because they're nasty people or bad people, right? They voted for him for very legitimate reasons because they have concerns about the way the world is going. We're in a period of great change driven by the internet, and it's causing all sorts of upheavals in people's lives. The gig economy, people whose lives a generation ago were stable suddenly don't look stable anymore. And when you get these changes, you look for answers to these questions of what the hell is going on in my life. And that's when people start believing in conspiracy theories. And one of the things I tried to do in the podcast was to say, yes, the one we're looking at is largely on the right of the political spectrum,
right?
QAnon, but the people on the liberal end of the spectrum and the left of the spectrum are not immune to this. We are all susceptible to the same pressures. When things happen that we don't understand, we search for simple answers. So an example, right? When Donald Trump won the presidency in 2016, against all expectations, right? Everyone, all the pundits said he can't win. What happened? A whole section of the liberal establishment in America and in Britain went, oh my God, the Russians must have done it, right? Now, of course, the Russians were involved. They were trying to help Donald Trump win. But, Mueller concluded that, no, he couldn't say that Donald Trump had colluded with the Russians in order to get him into power. And, the idea that Donald Trump only won the election because of Russian involvement is nonsense. In fact, it's a conspiracy theory, right? Yes. Donald Trump won the presidency because of internal structural issues within the United States. So on the liberal left end of the spectrum, people also got sucked into conspiracy theories.
The final question I'll ask you, to just look at that kind of spectrum, as you call it, of believers. The entry qualification is thinking that the election was stolen, and then the absolute extreme fringe is the satanic paedophile stuff. What does fighting back look like? Joe Biden talked yesterday. They can't really deal with the satanic paedophile stuff, so he needs to really stress, argue, fight the case for having won an election in 2020.
I wish I had a simple answer for
yes,
you,
of course.
But I'm afraid having spent all of last year on and off researching, reporting, and wrangling with this series, this podcast, I'm afraid I feel very bleak about the prospects for
really?
that. The secret is he or she who tells a better story is going to win, right? I think stories are so powerful, especially in times of change and confusion. So the people who are telling the truth, which is that Joe Biden won the election, and that even if there were small instances of electoral fraud, as there always are in elections, there wasn't anywhere near enough to change the outcome. They need to tell a better story, and they need to tell a better story than one that says there's an undercover group of patriots inside the U.S. government trying to help Donald Trump win over this satanic cabal of pedophiles who are trying to bring down the world, and they will eventually triumph in a great battle of good versus evil. That is a very powerful story, right? That is the stuff of Hollywood. And the people who are telling the truth you need to come up with a better story than just check your facts, because fact-checking is not going to win this battle.
Nicely put, if bleakly. Gabriel Gatehouse, you can find his podcast, The Coming Storm, wherever you get your podcast. Thanks, Gabriel, and thank you for ringing in. It's maybe quite nostalgic for when I had the pleasure of working with you on Newsnight. But
Me too.
mind how you go. Gabriel Gatehouse there, sounding another alarm bell about what is continuing to unfold in America and making a really useful point about the difference between Joe Biden's inauguration speech, which was conciliatory, which was, if you like, extending an olive branch, which was speaking of a world in which Democrat and Republican would remain sworn political enemies, but would not be inhabiting parallel universes, one of which respected objective truth and one of which didn't. The universe that Donald Trump has constructed rejects completely objective and observable truth. It denies evidence. And the speech yesterday sounded a lot more urgent and a lot less conciliatory. It really was a case of saying, look, now you have to pick a side. You pick the truth or you pick the lies of my predecessor. And I'm slightly unnerved to hear Gabriel, who's been working on this for years, working in this field for years, but on the specifics of these questions, as you've heard since the last American election, sounding so pessimistic about what the future may hold. I think perhaps in the not too distant past, when my ego was a little more fragile, I'd have been a little bit embarrassed by how many of you are better informed about the unfolding situation in America than I am. But now I'm just grateful that you listen to my program and I can benefit from the fruits of your understanding. Emma points out that the stuff we're discussing in America is echoed in their very culture. Things like the series Left Behind. InfoWars is always nicking the plots of decent sci-fi films to claim martyrdom and victimhood. The satanic pedo stuff is just a natural outgrowth of the satanic panic of the 80s and 90s that has never really gone away. It just bubbled under the surface. The QAnon stuff taps into a rich vein of culture that's already there. That's why it's so carpet-slippered, to coin that phrase of Michael Rosen's. And that ridiculous character Alex Jones, who Farage, of course, also consorted with, has always claimed to be Confederate royalty. This is taking us back to the first caller from Texas, or from a family that actively fought for states' rights. So part of the problem is that we don't understand, or part of my problem is that I don't understand enough. I don't have the history. And speaking of history, I don't know if you've seen the front page of today's Daily Mail, where Boris Johnson is calling for people who try to change history shouldn't be allowed to change history, which means he never writes another history book, which is good news. Something, I don't know whether he's realised this yet, but if Boris Johnson is rejecting the idea that history is a constantly evolving journey of discovery, interpretation, analysis and explanation, and that pulling down a statue of a slaver doesn't involve changing history, it just involves pulling down a statue of a slaver, changing values perhaps, changing morality, but Johnson sort of putting one foot on that bandwagon. Well, to his credit, and here's a phrase you don't hear me say very often, Jacob Rees-Mogg extolling the virtues, the obvious virtues of trial by jury. So Rees-Mogg coming down in favour of trial by jury. And now we live in a country where it is a pleasant surprise that the leader of the House of Commons has come down in favour of trial by jury. We might need a sound effect, Keith, for these moments where we find ourselves saying things that we would never have believed 10 years ago we would have to say out loud, live, on a national British radio station. Cool. That was a turn-up for the books, wasn't it, yesterday, when the Leader of the House of Commons came out in favour of trial by jury? Oh, happy days. And perhaps a kind of pale reflection of the movements that we're discussing stateside. Pat's in Harrogate. Pat, what would you like to say?
I think a lot of what I was going to say was covered very well by Nigel and Gabriel.
Good.
But the thing that worries me, I mean, I'm terrified about what's happening in America. I lived there for 6 years. I have many friends over there. And, you know, I'm very fond of the country. But it's the multifaceted attack on free and fair elections that is going on at state level, where 43 states have passed legislation restricting rights. Basically, if you look at it, of black and Latino and yes, largely democratic areas. It's multifaceted. With boundary restrictions, where they are redefining the borders so that districts that have a lot of black people in will have. That will be just one huge district, and districts with largely white.
Is it gerrymandering? Is that the phrase? Is that what it's called, or is that something else?
Sorry?
Is it gerrymandering? Or is that,
gerrymandering.
Is that what
That's
it's called?
exactly
Yes.
what it is.
Right. No, it's a well-established political tactic, albeit it's a well-established historical political tactic, albeit completely corrupt.
Yeah. But they're replacing they've passed legislation where a lot of the states can replace election officials with their own people. Election officials are being so intimidated, their lives threatened and everything, that they are resigning, and they are being replaced by Trump loyalist Republicans. And in some states, I can't quite remember now which, but there are definitely some states where the people who go to the electoral college, the electors, they are determined by the number of votes cast for either the Democrat or the Republican, and the one with the most votes, the electors go to the electoral college. But there's legislation in some states changing that so that they can kick out those electors and just put in their own Republican electors.
And explain to me, with knowing what you know about America, having lived there, how can this be happening in plain sight? How can it be happening in such an obvious and egregious fashion without...
Over decades, the Democrats have taken their eye off the ball at local and district and state level, and the Republicans have been ceding the courts, and it is so insidious, and it's been going on for such a long time.
But it's almost like a frog boiling exercise.
Absolutely.
It doesn't.
But there are so many states that are controlled now. And it's the swing states are the ones that
well, of course. I mean, they're trying to rig the game. They're obviously going to focus upon the areas that need the least rigging. So a swing state is worth rigging, whereas an area of massive Democratic support would be a mountain too steep to climb. Pat, thank you. I'm glad we had this conversation, but I can't claim that it's cheered me up much, and neither has the latest contribution to public discourse from the so-called Attorney General, Suella Braverman. Just as I finished praising Jacob Rees-Mogg, praising the Leader of the House of Commons for speaking out in support of trial by jury. Man alive, how far we fall without noticing. The actual Attorney General has just taken to Twitter to suggest that she might refer the verdict, the jury verdict in that Colston case, to the Court of Appeal, so that senior judges have the opportunity to clarify the law for future cases. So I don't know enough law to know whether or not they can overturn, but there you go. We didn't like that result at all that the jury handed down. So let's try and change the rules or clarify the law so that we don't have to rely on juries anymore to hand down verdicts on their peers. 10:56 is the time. Christy's in Arbroath. Christy, what would you like to say?
Well, I can't say that I'm going to cheer you up.
That would be quite a big ask at this point in the conversation, Christy.
Yeah, I can't say that I am much cheered myself the more that I watch what's going on in my own country.
Yes.
So I'm American, obviously.
How worried should we be? Let's start with the simplest question. How worried are you?
Very. Extremely. Like, I don't want to go home, sort of worried.
Yeah.
I think that this is a culmination of two threads that that the right primarily has been pulling on for decades, really. I think that the first is that they've set themselves up as the only arbiters of morality. And they've done that primarily by hooking people in the pro-life sort of movement.
Yeah.
Because I grew up both in religion and with very conservative parents.
Okay.
And the argument from everyone that I knew growing up was I could never vote for a Democrat because they kill babies.
Yeah. And we underestimate that. This is the religious right.
Yes.
Which somehow appointed Donald Trump as its champion, a man who, just off the top of my head, has boasted about sexually assaulting women and had to pay off a pornographic actress who he had sex with shortly after his last wife gave birth.
Yeah, well, this is what I'm saying, is that...
It's not exactly New Testament behavior, is it?
They've set themselves up as the only arbiters of
morality, decency,
based on the pro-life movement. So they're the only ones who are
And
going
when we say
to-
pro-life, you're talking about fetuses and embryos. You're not, for example, talking about refugees or Mexicans.
Yes, they
Yeah.
don't care about people
No, of
who are
course not.
actually born
No.
or children who are actually starving.
No,
They
God,
care
don't be silly.
about
Of course they don't.
unborn fetuses. Yes. So they've basically said we're the only ones who are going to appoint quote unquote pro-life judges. You need to vote for us, or else our country is going to go down the tubes.
And that's it. So
And-
there's so much going on, isn't there? Because I thought Gabriel was... Gabriel's always brilliant, but the bit I don't think anyone can answer is how many people who think the election was stolen are reachable and how many are not reachable. Do you see what I mean?
I don't think that they are reachable.
But you could...
And this is what scares me.
Yeah.
I think the other element that brought Trump into the picture was the connection to the interwar period in Germany. I've studied both American politics and did my thesis on the interwar period.
And you would draw that parallel confidently then?
Yes.
Wow.
People in the States, people here, and this is where I worry about this country.
Yes.
Are desperate, and they're desperate by design. The conservatives have slowly chipped away. This is where your slipper analysis comes in.
Yes, yes.
Slowly chipped away at people's lives. You know, people in the States can't afford health care. People here can't afford food.
But it's the fault of foreigners. It's the fault of lefties. It's the fault of...
We go from $200 billion for a failed test and trace system to we can't afford $5 billion for the universal credit uplift, right?
Yeah. We can't afford free school meals for children, the poorest children in the country, but we can look the other way while Boris Johnson accepts free holidays in Mystique and Mallorca.
And so Trump came in promising that he was going to level that playing field, right?
Right. And he has no intention of doing so, but he has they're the fuel in his engine, if you like, for the pursuit of self-interest.
Yeah, and the thing about Trump...
I'm late for the news, Christy. This will have to be your final sentence. I'm late for the news.
The thing about Trump and the thing about Boris is that they're completely willing to lie. So it doesn't matter that they didn't have any intention of helping people out.
And once that objective truth is broken, then all traditional bets are off, which I think was the point of Biden's speech yesterday. And I don't know whether you would call it misplaced patriotism, but I still balk slightly at those parallels. I've made them myself in the past, and I still cling to the idea that Trump and Johnson are very different creatures. But on that simple question of lying, blatantly lying, barefaced lying at 2 o'clock and telling the polar opposite lie at 3 o'clock. I don't think anyone can challenge what Christie said. I think there were 5 blatant lies in the last PMQs, and you still had some right-wing journalists taking to Twitter to say that Angela Rayner had really been on the ropes during that exchange. And was he lying yesterday when he offered a sincere apology for the flat redecoration scandal? We're going to move on to that, possibly next. When are you going to wake up, James? Boris and Trump are cut from the same cloth. You're worried about what's happening in the USA. You should be very worried about the UK. Well, it's not either or, is it? I think you can be worried about two things at the same time. It is possible to hold two thoughts in your head at the same time. But I take your point. So I have resisted the urge to continue talking about the situation in America. So my apologies to Chris in Massachusetts, Tim, Jacob. I only mention Massachusetts because I love the idea that our reach is now so enormous. Start talking about some journalism that's been done by a journalist on a rival network, and lo and behold, the journalist rings in. Start talking about American politics, your switchboard fills up with people either from or in America. But also to Ivor and to Mark and to Robert, who's in Perth. I don't know whether you're in Australia or Scotland, but we'll return to this, I think, and hopefully I'll be a little better informed. It is part of the problem that I mentioned at 10 o'clock, though. The more informed you are, the more worried you get, and there is a temptation to look away from the ugly stuff.